Fantastic. So with us for the closing panel, I'm really thrilled to have four fabulous thinkers and doers. Beside me, I have Bryan Bixcul, Global Coordinator of SIGRE Coalition, which stands for Securing Indigenous Peoples' Rights in the Green Economy. And Bryan is Maya-Tz'utujil. Did I say that correctly? Tz'utujil. Okay, I'll have to work on that. Thank you. I have Jacob Ellis, founder and co-lead the Impact Coalition for Future Generations. With us also is Manome, head of Development Risk Practice, Crisis Bureau of UNDP. And finally, Cronin, Senior Director, Global Intelligence of ClimateWorks Foundation. So I would love to just pose a really specific question to each of you about sort of where we go from here, what we need to think about, and as I said in my opening remarks, sort of tangible ways to really advance this agenda. So Bryan, let me start with you. You work at the sharp edge where Indigenous people's rights and transition to green economy are often portrayed to be at odds. For example, as it relates to meeting the global need for transition minerals. From your experience, what shifts in power dynamics or decision-making processes can make space for both transition and rights?
Thank you so much for that question. And Maltios Chabe, Ruth, Watch, Chupan. That's a greeting in my indigenous language, which is Maya-Tz'utujil, the land of the corn in Guatemala. I'm very happy to be here about very good conversations with many people. So I would like to start by saying that with the current dynamics, unfortunately, these two forces are incompatible. Because the proper safeguards protecting the rights of indigenous peoples and the well-being of our ecosystems are not yet in place. It's been 35 years since the adoption of the ILO Convention 169 and 17 years since the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And yet today, there are countries that still don't recognize indigenous peoples in their countries, much less their rights. And even though we have strong frameworks like the UN Convention, the issue is that indigenous people's rights are not upheld, they are not honored, and they are not implemented to the minimum standards as prescribed in the UN Declaration. Similarly, there are widespread rights violations today. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center just recently put out a report that says that there has been 835 human rights allegations against companies involved in the extraction of transition minerals from 2020 to 2024. So just think about that. It's a huge number. And these are real people. This is just not a number. Some companies show such disregard for indigenous people's rights that are not only negligent, but they are criminal. Take the case, a recent case from the Harita Group in Indonesia, for example, a company that has operated nickel mines in Obi Island for over a decade. In a recent report that I'm sure many of you might have seen from the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, they uncovered that the company was fully aware that its activities were contaminating local water with toxic, cancer-causing chemicals. Internal documents revealed that they knew about contamination of the water since 2012. And so at the beginning of the symposium, Ben Okri was asking a very good question. What is a human? And we need to also understand who is deciding which lives are more valuable than others. And another important question, right? Who gets to decide what justice looks like for us? So this is not what a just transition looks like. We are talking about a just transition now, and that's not what it looks like. And we also have to challenge the notion of the just transition, right? Because unfortunately, contrary to what the dominant narrative wants us to believe, we are not experiencing an energy transition. We are experiencing something called an energy addition. We are just layering more energy production on top of dirty production of energy. We are layering so-called renewables, which are not neutral, of course. They are producing huge impacts on the lands of indigenous peoples and driving more extraction, more consumption, and environmental degradation. I would also like to make a very important point, is that indigenous peoples have a right to free, prior, and informed consent. This is a collective right of indigenous peoples. It's also a human right. And this is a right that gives us the right to withhold consent to any activities that affect our lands, our territories, and resources. And consent includes the right to say no, to say yes, or to say yes with conditions to projects that come into our lands. So what we are asking to companies, if they are hearing this conversation, is respect our right when we say no to the projects that you want to implement on our lands. And so the other very important message I want to deliver today is that free, prior, and informed consent should be at the heart of all systemic risk assessments. This isn't only about indigenous people's rights. It is also about the rights and well-being of our ecosystems. These are two sides of the same coin. After all, we are stewarding 25% of the world's terrestrial surface, and there are high concentrations of biodiversity on these lands. So how do we make sure that these two things are compatible in the end? We need to start from a place of justice. Justice for indigenous peoples and justice for people, and making sure that their rights are upheld. At the Search Coalition, just briefly, just want to mention that we are bridging the gap between communities and justice by creating spaces for knowledge and experience sharing. We have hosted dialogues around the energy transition in Guatemala, in South Africa, in Brazil. We published a guide on free, prior, and informed consent to support communities in building their own FPIC protocols. Because let me tell you one thing, our shared goal should be to empower communities to make decisions for themselves. They are the best experts to decide what is best for their lands, for their livelihoods, for their futures. This is a very important message. We also engage automakers, battery producers, technology, finance, insurance, and mining companies to implement FPIC and respect for indigenous people's rights. We have had some successes with companies adopting indigenous people's rights risk, but it's not enough. We have to do more. And just to finalize, in the European Union, there are laws like the CSDDD, the Battery Law, and the Critical Raw Materials Act that offer a huge opportunity for indigenous peoples to finally realize those rights in the context of extractive industries. But unfortunately, the omnibus proposals that are being passed through right now in the EU threaten those gains. Most of all, we are inspired by communities. Communities know what is best for them. And that's the message I have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Serge is doing such important work. And I certainly hope we can work with you to talk about what we need to do to improve our tools and our thinking around systemic risk to include the issues that you raised, so thank you. Jacob, let me move to you. In your roles, you've helped shape global conversations around intergenerational justice, especially through the Wales Well-Being of Future Generations Act, which celebrates its 10th anniversary this year. So what lessons can be drawn from a decade of implementation in the global response to systemic risk?
Thank you, diolch. Firstly, I wanted to show my gratitude to you and the team. Many who work in the world of risk, futures, foresight, know that the work is hard. And I'm not afraid to admit that I've suffered burnout in several bouts over the last few years. So to come to Chantilly, to be able to have that quiet plurality that's here of tradition, vision, and reflection, I was deeply moved over the last couple of days just to recharge and reassess. So my thanks to you and the team. The Welsh model is one of many that draws and is inspired by the indigenous communities and the wisdom that thinking of generations past and present has been at the heart of the Welsh model since its inception in 2014. The Wales We Want was a national conversation with the people of Wales, framed at the time. The SDGs were being formulated in the background, but Wales is still the only country to have legislated to protect the interests and the needs of future generations, but also to legislate on the basis of the Sustainable Development Goals. We frame the positive language of our 7 interconnected well-being goals because it's important to talk about language. And the last couple of days, we've talked about the importance of language. So the SDGs talks about no poverty or 0 hunger, whereas in the Welsh model, we're talking about we want a prosperous Wales. We want a more equal Wales. We want a Wales of cohesive communities. You see the subtle difference in terms of wanting positive change rather than possibly the negative language that's associated with some of the SDGs. So to get buy-in from people from the beginning, you frame something that people want, they're more likely to work together to achieve it. The Wellbeing of Future Generations Act sets out 5 ways of working. These are the things that all our public institutions, from government to local government, health boards and some national bodies, they must demonstrate when making any decision. So they must seek to act for the long term, prevent problems from occurring or from getting worse, involve citizens and communities, integrate across silos and collaborate across sectors. Common sense, but who knew we had to legislate for common sense these days? We're living in the age of the polycrisis, that's been mentioned a few times, but if I can offer you a new word which my colleagues in Australia and the Foundations for Tomorrow are seeking to encourage the use of. Polycrastination, this idea that we are intentionally delaying not just one thing, but multiple issues. But I hope that the Welsh model provides not systemic risk as a backdrop, but systemic hope. And it is possible to legislate for hope. The Welsh model is but one example in that space. And we need to start shifting from moments, like UN forums and conferences, to movements, and start working far better with our communities and with the people that we claim to serve, with the knowledge not only of current generations, but the many millions, billions that will come on our planet in the future. And the very unique example, I wasn't going to share this story, but over dinner last night, I shared it, and it's an illustration of that systemic hope that we have in Wales in 1924, and I apologize for not being humble about this story at all. I'm very proud of this story, but I do apologize to those who've heard it now for the second time, or third possibly. So in 1924, on the aftermath of the First World War, 400,000 Welsh women signed a peace petition calling on the then US president to join the then League of Nations and calling for world peace. Now, at a time when women didn't have the full voting rights here in the UK, 400,000. Now, we only have a population of 3 million now. So you would have understood the context of the First World War and so on. That petition was handed to the US president, who welcomed the petition, and the petition was housed in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington until last year, when that petition was brought back to Wales and digitized in the ability then for current generations in Wales to identify, oh, I wonder if there's an ancestor on that, or I wonder who lived in my house, and did they sign this petition? So, I'm quite excited by the thought then of going through every surname in the hope of finding an ancestor. Alas, I couldn't find one. Until my grandmother over my shoulder pointed to a name and said, "That's your great-great-grandfather." And I said, "Well, we're looking for women, we're not looking for men." It transpires that my great-great-grandfather, Frederick Arthur Fox, was one of only 10 men who signed that petition. And it became deeply evocative and emotional for me last year that I found myself at the summit of the future, where I then, a century later, was sending a similar message that my great-great-grandfather was also sharing. So not only was in my ancestry there are futurists, and I'm proud to call him one, but also a feminist, and both those values ring true for me today. And it's an illustration that our ancestors matter, that we have to be good ancestors, as was coined yesterday, and is coined by Roman Krasnarich in his book. It's an example of the currents of change that transcend generational boundaries and the power of civic society. and dare I go even further, than the power of women in our history and in our current lives. And I end, therefore, with a reflection that on the 1st of March every year, we celebrate our national day in Wales on St. David's Day. And St. David's was coined to have said, do the small things, which is the phrase that we often use in Wales. However, there's an extension to St. David's mantra. He says, gwnewch y pethau bychain, cadwch y ffydd, byddwch lawen. Do the small things, keep the faith, and be joyful. And I wonder if those words are still true today. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing this story. Minako, you work in a very different world. You're with the United Nations. UNDP works where uncertainty and complexity are the norm, requiring a systems approach. How do you avoid siloed approaches in this work? And what opportunities do you see for doing so?
Thank you for these questions. And then before I answer to your question, I want to join Jacob in appreciating these opportunities. What I realize is that actually I don't know enough. I don't understand enough. And then a lot of reflections to learn more. And that has been also a journey for UNDP in reflecting its own way of looking at development as development agency, as accepting uncertainty and the systemic risks has a consequence of evolving method and then approaches that we deploy in development. So this sector of development is still largely informed by the assumptions of certainty and then also stability that reinforcing these assumptions. Like for instance, we still apply result-based management, which is a very linear way of looking at development with input, output, and an outcome. We also employ very conventional risk management that treat risk to actually treat and then control, and then not necessary to extract and then navigate uncertainty and then the systemic risks. So in this, as development agency, UNDP is now evolving a new practice that is called system and a portfolio approach. That is designed around uncertainty and the systemic risks as a key design concept. And then I want to explain what this portfolio system and portfolio is about from four key principles. The first key principle is as opposed to seeing problem from the way that we organize ourselves, we try to start with outside where dynamic system frame the issue. This helps us articulating a strategic intent, and this strategic intent is not objective or outcome in the logical framework sense, but it's a North Star that we want to get there, and then we could take all the way in adaptive way. We don't need to go there in the linear way. So there's a concept change of the objective outcome to strategic intent as North Star, changes also perspective of how we aim at development and how we design. The second characteristic is as opposed to throwing a laundry list of fragmented initiative, lots of projects that we have, and then often donor-driven, that I would say. And then also they are quite sector-oriented and then organizational-owned initiative. We try to drive coherence with this strategic intent that we develop as based on the first point. And then this, the coherence is not only within UNDP. Of course, like we are also siloed. We first need to work within ourselves, but with the partner within the UN agency, but also beyond. The third point is using learning not only for compliance and then accountability perspective, but we try to work to generate intervention constantly from the inside, from the ongoing work. So we call it as adaptive and dynamic portfolio management, where we get development intelligence to constantly adapt our action. The last point is about the human aspect. While all this in place, at the end, it's us, like human, who operationalize this portfolio approach. And we still struggle to change the mindset within the organization. And for that, we require the humbleness, imagination, and the compassion, and to keep challenging ourselves to learn and to change the way of working. And then at the same time, we see the incentive need to be changed. The system is so much in the competitions and then the siloed approach that would not incentivize our colleagues to share resources, information, and then making collective decisions. So it eventually needs to be linked with performance evaluations of the individual staff, and then also the whole organizational way to change the way of working. So this portfolio approach had started a few years ago, tested in different countries. A lot of feedback of how it's relevant and that it's possible, but at the same time, there are so many challenges to operationalize it. Again, as a system, we are so much siloed within the organization, either for procurement, recruitment, decision-making, fund management. So it's really about us who need to change first before we are addressing external complex and the systemic risk. So this has been our journey, and then we are right now launching development risk practice to apply systemic risks, the uncertainty and the systemic risks into development. And we apply network approach. And then we would like to share our experience of the system and the portfolio approach, both in the crisis context and the development context. And you are all welcome to join this practice. And then also give your hands and then also mind to help us improving this whole development practice.
Great. Thank you so much, Minako. Okay, so you're in the world of philanthropy. Philanthropy has a unique vantage point and a unique role in the ecosystem. What do you see as philanthropy's most important role in helping society not just understand systemic risk, but actually shift the conditions that produce it?
All right, thank you. I'm going to time myself. I also appreciate facilitating things.
Yep.
It's active work, but I'm also buzzing still a little from my breakout this morning. I found it did a good job of naming some of the big elephants in the room. I think that is helpful, so I want to just say, when talking about philanthropy, philanthropy is deeply enmeshed in the current system, and it is not inherently good or valorous. So when I'm talking about what philanthropy is doing in the trends, I just want to name that, because I think sometimes it's treated that way. We, ClimateWorks, where we sit, we gather data from a lot of foundations and philanthropy, what's going on. We track that, share some of that publicly. Foundation funding for climate mitigation philanthropy, where we focused, had been actually growing quite rapidly up through 2023. There is a bit of a data lag, but it looks like it peaked in 2023 and actually came down just ever so slightly in 2024. We don't have the final data there. And that it looks like it's going to pick up again in 2025. So that's sort of the good news in this current crisis moment. I think sort of good news, right? But philanthropy is not retreating, it is recalibrating right now. That's sort of the takeaway. I think it's still climate mitigation. Philanthropy is very much focused on sectors, high leverage points to reduce tons. That's still a big part of it, power, transport, industry, et cetera. There's a lot of focus now on resilience of the system, more on grantees, I think, and how, not resilience in the sense yet of climate adaptation, but just financial resilience, like in the operating environments that they work, trying to increase multi-year funding or core support funding, and then also just, just on other forms of risk in this environment. I'll leave it there. The things, though, that I'm particularly excited about and seeing with the climate mitigation philanthropy space is that merger more with adaptation, that there is not just these two different forms of climate action, and in fact a focus on more at areas where there are dual outcomes or multiple outcomes, where you're seeing benefits both in terms of reduction of greenhouse gases as well as increased resilience and capacity. We're, I think, within our team at ClimateWorks and some other foundations looking at that, at our climate mitigation strategies, and really, as the impacts of a changing climate are happening, we've been planning for a fairly certain, stable future, which in some ways, in hindsight, sounds silly, but we have been, and realizing that those impacts are coming, and now we need to climate-proof our mitigation strategies, one. I think there's a big push, and one we're hoping to work more with ASRA and the network on as last year we breached the 1.5 degree temperature threshold we had set out as sort of a safe limit, and what does, we're likely to come back down before we go back up, but what does that temperature overshoot mean in terms of storytelling, narratives, politics? It's really actually a quite different reality that we're in. And then the last is just, I think there's a lot of engagement with the funder community around short-lived climate pollutants and things that can affect near-term warming, as well as carbon dioxide removal, as well as other greenhouse gas removal, or looking again at the ways that we're able to affect near-term temperature, not just long-term stabilization. So I hope that I answered that question, and I was just under 4 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. One thing I've been amazed by this whole conference is just what incredible work everybody's doing. These four folks are an example of that, but just every conversation is filled with such amazing experience and deep thinking and courage and bravery has been talked about. So thank you all for your very, very good work. I think we have time for a few questions. So would love to open it up to the room. If we have a mic. Any questions for the panel? They're amazing insights. Yes, please. And just say your name and where you're from.
Hi, Carl Mallon from XDI and one of the ASRA Next Network people. I think that last point that you were making regarding adaptation, mitigation, hang on, we're actually going to have to make our mitigation climate-proof. I'm sort of interested in the extent to which a lot of the work we do is to try initially to get a recognition that adaptation is going to cost us money, yeah? And then to get both civil society, which is, oh, this is my house, I'm going to have to insure it, and now I'm going to have to make it resilient in order to make it insurable, for that penny to drop, and then also for businesses that they actually, the bulk of businesses now have to think about adaptation. We were doing data centers today. To what extent do you think we've got the opportunity to start having that going into our legal systems and a recognition that actually we need to start connecting the super profits which are still being earned from fossil fuels and get some of that money flowing into adaptation, essentially to start to try and embed these externalities into our economic and legal systems. Just wondering, on that last point, whether you're seeing the first sort of glimmers of those pieces, that penny starting to drop in order to accelerate decarbonisation.
Thanks, Carl. Casey, you want to take a stab at that one?
Well, the simplest question I heard was if I feel like I'm seeing those glimmers, and I don't think I am, but I'm one person, so I want to just say that. I do think it gets at, and some of that question, you have scales of philanthropy, government funding, and then the need that we know and has been quantified in terms of adaptation, and so where are the flows that can be redirected towards that? And I mean, so those conversations are happening. I don't know that I'm going to have a deeper answer for you, or if anyone else on the panel does, though.
Anybody else want to tackle that, or should we go to the next question? No. Everybody's like, it's too big a question, maybe. But to be continued. Thank you, Carl, for asking it. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
A name and...
Thank you so very much. Louis Klein, International Federation for Systems Research. I really liked the entire span from the local community to the philanthropic space. Now the question is from the side of all these projects looking into the local communities looking into the universe of philanthropy, it feels like an endless competition for small grants, competing with other communities. What, from your perspective, spanning the entire arc from the local communities to the philanthropists, what does it need for the philanthropists to come together as a community that allows to dissolve that competition in the field and to work together and bring about what we've seen in other spaces as sort of harvesting the synergies by walking together rather than keeping up operating in silos?
Thank you. And not to put Casey on the spot, but that is a question about philanthropy, but it's actually relevant, I think, to the whole panel. UNDP also provides support, and you seek support. So perhaps others have a perspective on that as well. But Casey, I see you've got a microphone in your hand. Do you want to talk a little bit about trying to dissolve competition and encourage collaboration?
Do I want to? I mean, I actually love to have that conversation, not necessarily on this panel, on this stage right now. Right, it feels funny as me as an individual here to speak on behalf of a large group, that I think the sense that there's competition in philanthropy, and does philanthropy recognize that, or are there places where they're coming together to talk more about that? I think so. I don't have a lot more to offer. It's a hard question, I'm sorry.
Did you,
Just
Jacob, please?
very, very briefly, I think that the Welsh model is the one that I presented today, but actually there are many examples across the world of small nations doing this very well. So my invitation is to kind of look at countries like Wales, who are great kind of test places for stress testing, or for experimenting in different ways, where integration is the law, and we are seeing different agencies coming together, sharing resources, seconding staff, spending time in communities, and giving permission somewhat for collaboration. And that sounds absolutely nonsense that you need that kind of permission, that invitation. But I think that go to the small countries. There is so much to absorb from them in terms of integration and collaboration. And we've seen, very little mention of COVID over the last couple of days, but it was again a good example, particularly in Wales, of partners coming together. So where we're seeing collaboration coming together on the back of crises, and still maintaining that collaboration post-crisis as well, if there ever was a post-crisis.
Thanks. Bryan, did you want to jump in?
Yeah,
Please.
I just want to briefly answer that question, but I think it's not in my area of expertise, but I can talk briefly, I guess, from our own experience, because we also provide small grants to communities that are in need, communities in the Lithium Triangle, for example, in South America, and in other places of the world, South Africa, and DRC, and other places. So the need is so great from communities. And the one message I guess I want to get across for the philanthropy sector is to trust communities and to trust in their self-determined priorities. I like to tell a story. For example, we visited a community in the Atacama Desert in Salar de Maricunga. It's a very high altitude. It was a beautiful place. Salar de Maricunga in Chile is currently threatened by lithium extraction. And we went to the community, and you would think, if you're an outsider, and I was an outsider, I am indigenous, and but I come from Guatemala, and being in this place, and when you ask them what their priorities are, you might think, well, we want to take a legal case, or we want to use the money for, I don't know, we want to start a project to defend the land or security or anything else. But when we went to the community and they requested help from us, and we said, how can we help you? And they said, well, we want to start a community project so we can take care of our artifacts and start a small museum for us. We want to start a radio so we can sing our songs on the radio, transmit our knowledge through the radio, and our language, right? Indigenous peoples in many places of the world are fighting this battle through ceremony, because ceremony reminds us of this relationship with the land, this intrinsic relationship. And it's so important for us. Last 54% of the transition minerals that are currently being extracted are on the lands of indigenous peoples. So trust indigenous peoples to make those decisions for themselves. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yes, please, Minako, please. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Quickly from this financing perspective. So like right now, financing is quite siloed. Like for instance, which sectors are funded? Agriculture separately from energy, and then from skill, and then silo in terms of what the KPI for different forms of funding. Grants for soft skill, loans for large-scale infrastructure, concessional finance for investment and the return. I think it turned out to be that it's only that when we focus on the key intersections in the system that we could make impact, but also we could avoid do harm. Not doing that, we could actually do harm by approaching the sector level and then not impacting entire system, and it could do actually harm. And then how to find that intersections. And then I value the colleagues' interventions about the wisdom from indigenous people. So there are local population who know well how the system intersects. So assessment analysis is important, but we often lack this qualitative and the contextual wisdom. And I think that should be combined to identify this leveraging point in the system.
Great, thank you, Minako. Perhaps one more question before we go to closing remarks.
Yeah, Chris Hobson from ANU.
Great.
You may want one more question after me.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
All right, let's hear it, Chris.
I like collaboration too, and I like converging tributaries, but this is not the world that we're in many ways. So I would like to talk a bit about conflict and how we deal with conflicting interests and conflicting actors. 2 of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are not represented at this meeting, as far as I'm aware. Right. So how do we think about advancing these goals in conditions where we have very powerful states and actors which we're not involving in these discussions? How does China think and talk about these issues? I apologize to our UN colleague for asking these type of questions, but I think if we want to talk about cooperation, we also need to think about conflict as well. So I'd like to ask this and then ask someone else to ask another nice question to finish.
That's a big question, Chris, so we may just have time for that, but hopefully we can turn it into something, if not positive, then hopefully at least forward-looking and forward-moving. So maybe we can just go along and final words, just a minute to Chris's question. Sort of how do we move forward when there is conflict, when there are vested interests, and when the issues that we're dealing with seem quite intractable?
Yeah. So I guess, I can address the part of conflict because that, sadly, it's a daily reality for indigenous peoples. We have conflict on our lands. Many of them are widely reported on, and many people die in silence where there are no cameras, no one to report the story. Those are our daily realities, unfortunately. And so to address conflict, we have to start from the place of justice. Any system that we want to build, and I had a conversation with someone, I can hardly remember their name, but they were talking about the systems as a machine that we try to fix every time that something goes wrong. And every time it gets bigger and bigger, and it's more scary for us to engage in those spaces. And I think we need to rebuild and reimagine entirely the systems because they are not working for us. If that wasn't the case, it would be different. So we have to work together to solve those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Bryan.
was hoping for a little bit longer to work out a better answer than the one I'm about to give. And refrain from repeating the do the small things, keep the faith and be joyful as a kind of simplistic answer to it. I think maybe starting in a space that some conflict is okay, like debate comes from conflict, challenge, scrutiny, new ideas, new perspectives. We don't listen enough, we talk a lot. And I think that what's at the heart of the work that I haven't mentioned the Impact Coalition at all, only given my Wales hand, but the Impact Coalition is framed around the Declaration on Future Generations that was passed at the summit last year. And there are plenty of examples, that being one of them, where countries have agreed together and found consensus. And the SDGs is a good example of countries coming together from different beliefs, different understandings, but have a joint common vision. I'm not saying that's easy now and that that's been successful, but there are plenty of examples in our history of good people and difficult people coming together to find common goals. And I stem my motivation and my positivity from knowing that our history has shown us that it is possible to collaborate, it is possible to find joint initiatives. So I'll say it for the fourth time. Do the small things, keep the faith, and be joyful. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you. Minako, one minute.
Sure, very quickly. The conflict themselves are part of the system, like systemic risks. And what I realize is that we treat conflict and then peace building in completely different domain from climate, food security, water issue. And indeed, I think the whole point is to bring in conflict in our way of thinking and then, analyzing the situations and then look at the systemic risk. I think that's one thing. And then also I believe there are also emerging opportunities often out of the conflict as well. For instance, if the conflict at the global level, there could be more momentum and emerging like energies and the coalitions among the the citizens and then more ordinary people to really come up with the collective voices for instance, peace building. So I also want to believe in positive or opportunity side of the conflict as well. So the system thinking and system-based approach to conflict should also look at emerging opportunities to seize for our action as well.
Thanks, Minako. Casey, you've got the last word. Conflict.
I hope you get the last word after this. So I think I always think asking that question of who's not in the room is important and helpful, though I don't think the fact that there aren't people from, or a strong representation from the two other countries on I don't think that's who feels missing in this room. So it's both. I both appreciate the question, but I might challenge that more, and it's maybe regional representation. I know in our breakout, which I think that's the facilitator I can't see as well from back here. We did talk a lot more on this group is a very, it's researchers, academics, civil servants. It's a fairly privileged group, and so there I think is a question of how do we expand on this network. I think one of the original prompt to this question was more on what stood out this week or this weekend, I guess. And I did really come in excited at the variety in perspectives and backgrounds. I won't quite use the word diversity because that can mean something else, but I do think there's something really strong in this network that I find quite exciting. And so I think then how do you build on that and build out from there and keep asking who's not here in the network, whose voices aren't being heard. But again, I'm not sure that the two, anyway, thank you.
That is actually a beautiful note to end on. A very strong kernel in the core, and then how do we have that grow and build over time? Thank you to our panel. Very much appreciate it. Let's give them a hand. I invite you to sit down.